What you are about to hear is the story of a forbidden love between a noblewoman and a young artist, set on the balcony of a grand Italian villa in the 15th century. Their passion defies society's expectations, but betrayal and danger threaten to tear them apart forever. The grand villa perched on the rolling hills of Tuscany, its marble balconies overlooking vast stretches of vineyards and olive groves. The sun set behind the villa, casting a warm golden glow across the gardens below, but the world of luxury and privilege within its walls felt cold and suffocating to Lady Isabella. She stood on the balcony, staring out into the distance, her heart heavy with the weight of her obligations. As the daughter of a wealthy noble family, she was bound by duty, expected to marry Duke Alessandro, a powerful and ruthless suitor chosen by her father. Her life was mapped out before her, a future that promised security but no joy, no freedom. That evening, as the villa prepared for a grand banquet in Duke Alessandro's honor, a new figure arrived, Lorenzo, a young artist, barely in his 20s but already famed for his talent. He had been summoned to paint Lady Isabella's portrait, an honor bestowed by the Duke as a way to display his future bride's beauty to the world. Lorenzo was a man of humble origins, yet his skill with the brush had earned him favor with the nobility. Still, despite his growing reputation, he knew his place in this world. He was a servant to the wealthy, expected to obey, to create, but never to step beyond his station. When Lorenzo was introduced to Isabella, their connection was immediate, though they barely exchanged words. Her eyes, dark and full of longing, met his, and in that moment, something passed between them, an unspoken understanding of the deep loneliness and desire for freedom they both shared. For Isabella, Lorenzo represented the world beyond the gilded cage she lived in. For Lorenzo, Isabella was the embodiment of beauty and grace, but more than that, she was a woman trapped, like him, by forces outside her control. As the first session for the portrait began, Isabella sat in her chamber, bathed in the soft light of the setting sun, while Lorenzo prepared his canvas. The air was thick with silence, but there was no mistaking the electricity between them. Lorenzo's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his brush, capturing the curve of her face, the softness of her lips. He glanced at her often, his heart pounding in his chest, feeling a pull toward her he had never experienced before. Their conversations were tentative at first, polite, yet as the days passed, their exchanges grew deeper. Isabella spoke of her life, her fears, and the unbearable weight of her engagement to the Duke. Lorenzo, in turn, revealed his dreams of freedom, of traveling beyond the constraints of courtly life. And slowly, their meetings on the balcony became more than just sessions for the portrait. They became moments of escape, where they could be themselves, free from the eyes of the villa's servants and the judgment of society. One night, under the light of the full moon, as the gentle breeze carried the scent of the surrounding vineyards, Lorenzo lingered on the balcony long after their session had ended. Isabella, wrapped in a delicate shawl, stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the stars above. "What if we could escape?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustle of the trees. "What if none of this mattered: titles, duties, promises?" Lorenzo turned to her, his breath catching in his throat. The intensity in her eyes mirrored his own. "We could," he replied, his voice filled with both hope and fear. "But the world we live in would never allow it." Their hands brushed, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver down Isabella's spine. They both knew the danger, knew the impossible nature of their growing affection, yet neither of them could pull away. That night, beneath the moonlit sky, something shifted between them, a spark that ignited a passion neither of them could control. The days passed, and with each stroke of Lorenzo's brush, the portrait of Lady Isabella came to life. But it wasn't just the painting that grew more vibrant. Their love, though unspoken, deepened with every passing moment. The tension between them was palpable, and as the time for her portrait to be completed drew near, so did the knowledge that their time together was running out. On the surface, they remained proper a noblewoman and her artist, engaged in nothing more than the creation of art. But in the hidden shadows of the villa's balcony, their stolen moments became increasingly dangerous. Under the cover of darkness, away from the prying eyes of the servants and the watchful gaze of Duke Alessandro, Isabella and Lorenzo would meet, their hands brushing, their conversations growing more intimate. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned shades of pink and purple, Isabella found herself once again drawn to the balcony. She had not intended to meet Lorenzo that night, but she felt his presence long before she saw him. Her heart leapt in her chest as he stepped into the moonlight, his eyes filled with the same longing she had tried to bury deep within herself. They stood in silence for a moment, the cool evening air wrapping around them. Isabella's pulse raced, and she knew she was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. "Lorenzo," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, "I can't keep pretending." Lorenzo's eyes darkened, filled with a mix of desire and fear. "Neither can I," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. "But if we're discovered?" She nodded, understanding the risk all too well. Her engagement to Duke Alessandro wasn't just a matter of family honor, it was a political alliance that her father had carefully crafted. Alessandro was powerful, wealthy, and ruthless. If he were to discover her love for Lorenzo, there would be no mercy. Isabella would be disgraced, her family ruined, and Lorenzo's fate would be far worse. But in that moment, as the moonlight cast a silver glow on his face, none of that mattered. Isabella stepped closer to him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't care," she whispered, the words a release of everything she had held back. "I don't care about duty or reputation. All I care about is this. About us." Lorenzo's breath hitched, his restraint crumbling under the weight of his love for her. He reached for her, his hands trembling as he kept her face, their foreheads touching as the world around them seemed to fall away. "Isabella," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, "you have no idea what I would give to protect you. To be with you." Their lips met in a kiss that was filled with all the passion they had been forced to hide. It was a kiss that spoke of their love, their fear, and the impossible future they longed for. Isabella melted into his embrace, her fingers clutching his tunic as if she could hold onto him forever, as if this kiss could somehow defy the reality of their world. But the weight of their situation hung over them like a storm. When they finally pulled apart, the gravity of what they had done settled over them. Their love was no longer a secret whispered in the shadows. It had taken on a life of its own, and there was no turning back. "I don't know what to do," Isabella admitted, her voice trembling. "I can't live like this, hiding, pretending. But if Alessandro finds out..." Lorenzo's jaw clenched, his heart aching for her. He knew the danger they were in, but he couldn't let her go. "We'll be careful," he said, though his voice held little conviction. "No one has to know." But even as he said the words, they both knew it wasn't true. The walls of the villa had eyes, and the more their love blossomed, the more impossible it became to keep it hidden. And they were not the only ones watching. The next day, as Lorenzo worked on finishing the final details of Isabella's portrait, a servant slipped into the room, her face pale and anxious. "My lady," she whispered, her eyes darting toward Lorenzo before looking back to Isabella. "I overheard something. Something terrible." Isabella's heart sank. "What is it?" "It's Duke Alessandro," the servant replied, her voice trembling. "He's heard rumors about you and the artist. Someone told him someone in the villa must have seen you together." Isabella's blood ran cold. She had always known their love was dangerous, but now it was clear just how close they were to being exposed. If Alessandro had heard even a whisper of their affair, their lives would be in danger. Without a word, Isabella rose from her seat and rushed to the balcony, where she found Lorenzo waiting, his eyes wide with concern. "Lorenzo," she whispered, her voice breaking, "he knows?" Lorenzo's face paled, his hand gripping the balcony's edge. "We have to leave," he said urgently. "Tonight." Before he can do anything. Isabella hesitated, her mind racing. Could they truly escape? Could they leave behind everything, her family, her title, his art, and build a life together in secret? The thought both thrilled and terrified her. But before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Heavy, purposeful footsteps. It was too late. The sound of Duke Alessandro's heavy footsteps echoed through the stone halls, drawing closer with each passing second. Isabella and Lorenzo stood frozen on the balcony, their hearts pounding as the reality of their situation came crashing down around them. There was no time to run, no time to hide. Alessandro had discovered their secret, and they knew what that meant. Lorenzo's mind raced, his instincts screaming at him to take Isabella and flee, but there was nowhere to go. He reached for her hand, gripping it tightly, as if his touch alone could shield her from the storm that was about to descend upon them. "Stay behind me," he whispered, his voice low and tense. "I won't let him hurt you." Isabella's eyes welled with tears, but she nodded, her heart breaking under the weight of the moment. She had known from the start that their love was dangerous, but she had never imagined it would come to this. The door to the balcony burst open, and Duke Alessandro stormed in, his face twisted with rage. His eyes flicked between the two of them, settling on Lorenzo with a look of pure hatred. "So it's true," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You dare touch what belongs to me? You, a common artist, a nobody." Lorenzo stepped forward, positioning himself between Isabella and Alessandro. His body was tense, but his voice was calm. "Isabella does not belong to you," he said, his words measured but filled with conviction. "She is not a prize for you to claim." Alessandro's expression darkened, his hand resting on the hilt of the sword at his side. "She is mine by right, artist. A right you have violated." Isabella's heart seized as she saw Alessandro's hand move toward his sword. She stepped forward, desperation in her voice. "Alessandro, please, this is not what you think. But her words were cut off as Alessandro drew his sword in one fluid motion, pointing the blade directly at Lorenzo. "Silence!" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "This insult will not go unpunished." Lorenzo's eyes remained locked on Alessandro, but his thoughts were entirely focused on Isabella. He knew he couldn't win in a fight against the Duke, but he had no intention of letting her face Alessandro's wrath alone. Slowly, he raised his hands, his gaze steady and fearless. "If you're going to kill me, then do it. But know this, I love her. I have loved her from the moment I saw her, and no matter what you do to me, that will never change." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Isabella's breath caught in her throat, her mind reeling. She stepped between them, her hands raised in a plea. "Please, Alessandro, don't do this. I love him. I know I've betrayed your trust, but I cannot live in a world where I'm forced to deny my heart. For a brief moment, Alessandro's expression faltered, as if the words struck him somewhere deep within. But then, just as quickly, the rage returned, burning even brighter. "You would choose him over me?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "You would throw away everything for this nobody?" Isabella's answer was clear and immediate. Yes. The air between them crackled with tension, and for a moment, it seemed as though the world itself had stopped. Alessandro's face twisted into a mask of fury, his grip tightening on the sword. But before he could strike, another voice interrupted the scene. Alessandro came the cold, clipped voice of Countess Emilia, Isabella's aunt, who stepped out from the shadows, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. She had followed them, her jealousy and desire for power driving her to expose the affair to the Duke. "There's no need for bloodshed here. You can have your revenge, but do not stoop to such brutality." Alessandro's nostrils flared, but he lowered his sword, though the threat in his eyes remained. "What do you suggest, Emilia?" The Countess smiled wickedly, her gaze settling on Isabella. "Exile him. Banish the artist from this land. Strip him of his name, his work, everything. Let him live with the shame of knowing he will never again see the woman he loves. And Isabella, she will remain here, bound to you, Alessandro, as was always intended." Isabella's blood ran cold at the thought. To lose Lorenzo, to never see him again, it was a fate worse than death. Lorenzo turned to Isabella, his heart breaking as he saw the pain in her eyes. He knew that Emilia's plan would destroy them both, but it would leave Isabella alive. "Isabella," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I will leave, if it means you will be safe." Isabella shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, Lorenzo. I can't let you go. Not like this." But Alessandro stepped forward, his grip on Lorenzo's shoulder like a vice. "You will leave," he growled, "and if you ever return, I will kill you myself." The world seemed to close in around them. Isabella reached for Lorenzo, her fingers brushing his for what she knew could be the last time. "I love you," she whispered, her voice breaking with sorrow. "And I love you," Lorenzo replied, his eyes filled with the same agony. "Always." With that, Alessandro dragged Lorenzo away, the artist's fate sealed. As the heavy doors of the villa slammed shut, Isabella collapsed onto the balcony, her sobs echoing through the cold night air. Days turned into weeks, and Isabella's heart ached with the emptiness of Lorenzo's absence. She was trapped in a life she no longer wanted, her love torn away from her, her future darkened by Alessandro's looming presence. The portrait that Lorenzo had so carefully painted remained unfinished, a symbol of a love that was never allowed to fully bloom. But even in the darkest moments, Isabella held on to hope. For in her heart, she knew that love, true love, could never be erased. She believed that one day, somehow, she and Lorenzo would find each other again, beyond the reach of society's expectations, beyond the grip of duty and fear. And so, with every beat of her heart, she waited for the day when they would reunite, no longer bound by the chains of privilege or the cruelty of fate.